Welcome to Podomation, where we talk about all things automation and industrial cybersecurity. Podomation is brought to you by ISA, the International Society of Automation.
Hi, welcome to the next episode of Podomation. I'm Morgan Foor and I'll be your host today. I'm here with Marco Ayala and Steve Mustard to talk about the next set of threats in maritime cybersecurity. Today we're going to talk about some issues that are occurring in the Mediterranean area specifically, but also all around the world. So what can we do as the International Society of Automation to do a deep dive into current events, how that affects operational technology, because that's where our standards live, and what can we do to improve our cyber posture in the future? Let's dive in. Steve, Marco?
Hey there. Marco here, ISA fellow, and also the technical director at ABS Consulting. Happy to be here to talk through this. Steve?
Hi, Steve Mustard, also ISA fellow. I'm an independent automation consultant specializing in cybersecurity.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Greatly appreciate it. Marco, my first question is for you. Let's go more so into current events and things that are going on. What are some recent maritime cyber incidents or near misses that have caught your attention, and what lessons should the industry take from them?
Yeah, so I will say the maritime sector did see a pretty significant increase in surge in reported cyber incidents. I think now that we're even tracking a lot of this even more, especially within the industry, I would say the ones that really caught my eye were the internal tampering. So with the GNV Fantastic, which was a ferry, that was sometime around December of last year, where a remote access Trojan was installed via sneakernet, as we like to call it, or through portable media. Luckily, that was caught, and there has been some arrest, or at least an arrest made of 2 crew members. One was detained. That one was interesting because that has a lot of features of things that bypass a lot of your security that you have as a company, you have as a vessel, especially bringing in some type of remote access Trojan into your environment is something we've been dealing with for many, many years. So that one stuck out. Also some hacktivist campaigns against certain vessels, also port nations. There was a state attack that happened sometime last year, mid last year, where comms had impacted some of the terminal operation systems. And so if you're not moving things within a terminal, a lot of things come to a screeching halt. So those can have impacts, especially with supply chain. So think about your food, any humanitarian aid that you might be providing. So those are some, along with GPS and GNSS spoofing. Look, the reality is, even since 2020, 2021, we've had war happening overseas. Now we have a new extension here towards Iran. So there's a lot of cyber activity in play, and we're seeing some of that here in the U.S. And I will say that uptick is only increasing. And we need to make sure that we're protecting our operational technology. Although a lot of these have come or try to come through the IT enterprise perspective, the fact is that these could have non-direct or indirect impacts to operational technology, where you either have to shut down or lower your amount of movements. And the same is true with vessels. You know, once you get onto some of these ships, especially the older ships, it very much flat networks. And although we're getting better and we're adapting standards like ISA 62443, there's still a lot of room for improvement. Steve?
Yeah, great points, Marco. Today, if you want to disrupt people's operations, the best thing you can do is disrupt the supply chain. And we saw non-cyber examples of that in the past few years, like the blockage of the Suez Canal, and then prior to that, COVID. And what we learned through all of these kind of incidents, including the Strait of Hormuz today, is that everybody is very dependent on shipping goods around the world. And you can create chaos just by disrupting vessels. So unfortunately, it's a terrible target to aim for. I think the other thing you hinted at as well is that different kind of supply chain. So if you talk about the different players who are involved in providing all of the systems that go on a ship, if you want to introduce cybersecurity related incidents into the maritime industry, we can talk about the security of the vessels in a moment, but one of the best things to do is to disrupt the least secure players in the supply chain. So if you can introduce malware into the supply chain earlier, then it gets into vessels and other operational facilities like ports, then it's much easier potentially to do that than it is to attack the port or vessel directly. So I think there's two different supply chain things here that are quite interesting and coincide with the maritime industry specifically.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit because this is a great point, right? We've talked in previous episodes of this podcast, particularly about how state actors have come in and attacked agriculture, how they've attacked water, wastewater. We've even talked about maritime and the supply chain a little bit, but we've seen recently how geopolitics are having a massive impact on most industries, and especially this low-hanging fruit that you speak of, and how that becomes a larger vulnerability. We've seen bombs inserted through cell phones. Very interesting. We have seen MDM devices used to even hack into operational technology, which I don't think is something that people usually link together. Can you guys talk about that a little bit?
I'll start. Kind of following on from what you said there, Morgan, and what I was saying is a few things. So you mentioned about inserting things into products, and that's physical and also software wise. There's also the fact that a lot of technology is inherently insecure, right? So you buy even operational technology products are insecure, but IT products are very typically insecure. So wireless access points and cameras and other kinds of networking devices that people buy are based on designs and blueprints from a very small number of players. And so that means that the design is well known, the software is well known, the vulnerability is well known, and also the usernames and passwords are well known. Now, if you put that together on a network, and then, like Marco said, you put that on a flat network with no segregation and very little protection, now you've got the possibility that people can compromise those as well. And, obviously we can talk more about that in a moment, but, one of the things people need to do is to think more about buying secure products and demanding security in their products from their vendors. So that's going to be one of the big things that we're going to have to see going forward to manage this kind of risk, I think.
Well, obviously, we talked a little bit already about the geopolitical tensions and what have you, and these are things that are only making things quite a bit worse. And so there's hacktivists, there's sympathizers, there's different groups that are trying their best to target systems that are out there, whether they're maritime or even critical infrastructure, period. And so we have seen a jump in that, especially here on our side. But what I will say is that we need to make sure that we're not doing silly things with our systems and equipment. We need to make sure that we're not, publicly connected to, public infrastructure such as, internet. And surprisingly, those are the low-hanging fruit that most of these threat actors try to target. If it's exposed and it's easily discoverable, and we've seen that over the last 5 years. And I think threat actors are still taking advantage of that. That's out there. Now, that being said, and we talked a little bit about security, and Steve made some great points about making sure you're getting secure by design. We're still moving the needle there. Some other aspects of it, which we did cover a little bit ago, was that the third-party vendor piece. And so many of these vessels, many of these ports rely on 3, maybe 4 critical vendors for their vessel operations and their port operations, and those are outside of their control. So those companies that either are supporting them have software stacks, communications networks, people that could be socially engineered or targeted, and those can be the vectors into your secure environment. And we've seen that, especially over the last 5 years, where we've had software applications for third parties impact ships out at sea, not from an operational state, but from a knowledge and visibility perspective. And so these nation state threat actors, are going after these supply chain aspects. And to Steve's point, many of them don't have secure by design technology in their possession or in their stack per se. And especially when you get down to systems or vessels that are 20, 30, maybe even 40 years old, a lot of it may have new paint on the outside, but the systems are still antiquated. But yet they have conversion over to some Ethernet, and that gives them that level of exposure through these flat networks. So.
Yeah, I want to add to that, Marco and Morgan. In 62443, one of the things that we have is this concept of security levels. So we have security level 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 being the lowest level, basic protection against inadvertent actions, and then all the way up to security level 4, which is supposed to protect against essentially nation states, right? Now, what Morgan's saying is, in this environment, you've got nation states looking to create harm to each other. And as we've been talking about this, the funny thing about this whole thing is that you don't need to be a nation state to compromise most OT environments, including maritime vessels, right? You are basically still operating at that security level 1, right? The idea that you could get anybody close to security level 4 today is laughable, because we're not even at security level 1 in many cases. So the simplest compromise, because of insecure products and then installed in an insecure way and then managed with third parties, like you say, in an insecure way without the right procedures, it just creates this environment where the vulnerabilities are everywhere, and the most basic inadvertent attack, never mind a malicious attack, can bring a vessel or a port into an inoperable state quite easily.
Yeah.
Right, and that's more of the question here too, right? I mean, you can go to any of these ports or around the U.S., around the world, really, and you've seen lots of different protesting groups, strikes that are happening. People say we don't want automation. Well, you guys are in fact arguing that we do need automation. I mean, the Society of Automation, in fact, is arguing that automation depends on people. Can we talk about that a little bit, and how, not just in saying, hey, you need to use this standard, but how can we mitigate risk for cybersecurity with automation?
Yeah, Steve?
Well, we talked about a couple of things. So it really does start with the right kind of security by design. So that means that you have the right intent from the outset. You say, I'm going to buy products that have security features that I can enable to make me more secure. I don't buy products that have default hard-coded passwords, for example. And not only that, but I demand that from my vendors, right? I say, I'm not going to buy this unless you do these things. That's the very first step. Then you have to obviously design these things so that the environment is secure. So 62443 has the concept of zones and conduits. And the whole point of zones and conduits is to say that you can create, you can break your environment down, your vessel, for instance, into zones. And those zones have features or requirements that are specific to the security risk that they have. So the radar, for instance, would be a very high risk piece of equipment. So you'd want to protect that more, perhaps, than the crew Wi-Fi, for example. But you'd also want to segregate the crew Wi-Fi from the radar system on the network, so that, if someone was on the crew Wi-Fi, they can't inadvertently or intentionally get access to something like the radar. And then, you implement that. You have to then manage that, and managing that needs the right policies and processes for the organization who owns the vessel. But it also, to Marco's point, means that you have to manage everybody who touches the equipment, right? So that's the crew, but also the third parties especially. And you have to have better practices in place to say, we don't accept that we don't know who the people are, for instance. That's one of the most obvious things. And then we know they've been trained, and we know they follow the right procedures. And then, we also manage any changes to the environment as well in a controlled way. So we don't just say, oh, we're going to upgrade the Wi-Fi, for instance. Now we're going to add this new Aruba network, but we're going to do it in a different way from what we did before. So we're going to put it on the same network as the radar and everything else, but we're going to do VLAN segregation. So surely that's okay, right? It sounds okay, but it's not as secure, right? And the beauty of 62443 is it says you've got a risk assessment that you did originally, which tells you how to separate all the systems. And you've got to go back to that when you make a change and say, what are we doing and how does that impact the risk? Honestly, nobody I know does that at the moment, right? No, in maritime industry or anything. Marco, you can correct me, but like everybody's just saying, we can do this. It works. We haven't had an issue yet. So why don't we keep doing that? And this is the biggest problem, right?
Yeah, I will say, and kudos to the 62443 standard by being incorporated in the EU for any new ship build. So as of 2024 Jan 1, any new ship builds must have risk assessment. They also have security controls, and these all map through and are fostered under 62443. So zones, conduits, security level targets, these are all there. So the good news is that new vessels that are coming out have some security baked in, but there's still some loose verbiage around it. You still need people, and the people, the process, the technology, the folks that are assessing, that are actually inspecting and auditing these security controls need to be competent, need to be trained to be able to facilitate and determine, are these truly deployed, as opposed to a check the box mentality. And I'm seeing a lot of great things coming out from the auditors. I know on the ABS side we're doing that as well, but there's other auditors out there to meet these new system builds. But when it comes to the component levels, we're having to use compensating controls because, as Steve was mentioning, many of the components that we're using have not been able to meet higher stringent security level capability to be able to achieve this. But again, you need to be able to create a roadmap for yourself to be able to meet that at some point in time, whether it's your vessels or whether it's your ports and terminals. So 6443 does a great job of that. And there's also training that folks can take in the maritime industry specific to 62443 and get their certification for risk assessor, for design and implement for the engineers and the folks that are hands-on, and then the run and maintain aspect. So think of that as far as your electronic technicians or ETs that are on board, any of your chief mates that are responsible for the systems, for the operational technology, and even all the way up to the sea level within these marine and maritime companies, chief of engineering, so forth, should have the training to understand what the risks are, not only in their fleet, but how to address those and how to make sure that their people are not only trained, competent, but enabled to be able to do the right thing and make corrective actions from that perspective. So I do see standards, our standard from the ISA's perspective and IEC's being adopted widely, and I'm starting to see some really great things come out of the E26, E27 requirements. It's a great start. We've got a long runway to be able to get better. But to Steve's point, there still are a lot of legacy vessels out there that don't fall under the new ship build. And so they're going to keep chugging along, doing migrations, maybe even being sold. That's another thing. A lot of these vessels may be sold to other companies that may have even weaker security mindset and that traverse all around the world, from the U.S. to even Singapore, and they may be flagged under different countries' flags. So the flag state matters. All these pieces matter, but at the end of the day, secure by deployment is probably the most important thing, and tying that to 62443 is really an imperative.
Can I add something as well? So what you said, Marco, is really interesting at the end there. That when we talk about the weakest link in the supply chain being the one that can be impacted, a great example is what you just said there, which is just because there's another shipping company out there that has less awareness and fewer controls in security, that doesn't mean that you aren't going to be impacted if you do your security right. Because as we saw, like if you block the Suez Canal because you disable the propulsion system on a vessel or you disable the radar so they can't operate, that impacts everybody. So it's actually in everybody's interest to drive these things, right? It's not just like I want to be Royal Caribbean and I want to make sure my cruise vessels are secure, but they need to know that everybody else who's using the shipping lanes is also secure and the ports are secure, so that you go to certain countries and maybe their standards are not as high. That can impact you as well. So it's kind of like you can't treat this like in isolation and say, oh, I'm doing a great job, so I don't need to worry about anybody else. The one other thing I wanted to say as well, risk thing, really important, because Marco said right at the beginning that the risks we're talking about are consequences to the operations, either of the port or of the vessels themselves. People just really don't understand that when we talk about cybersecurity. They talk about risk and then they say something, and it's a vulnerability they're talking about. Or they talk about, the failure of my PC workstation or my server or my network. That is not a risk. That is an impact or that is an incident that causes the impact. And the impact is the thing we need to drill home to people is, this is what can happen. We don't want to be fearmongers. We don't want to say doom and gloom and, one click on a phishing email and your ship blows up. But we also want to, on the other side, want to make sure that people understand if you click on the phishing email on the crew Wi-Fi and you haven't got a secure network, and then that causes the propulsion system to be disabled or the radar to be disabled, then you have an inoperable vessel. And you may not have an incident response procedure and you may not know how to recover from that. So you may have another sitting in the Suez Canal blocking it because you can't do anything with the vessel, right? So honestly, people just don't understand that basic point. So to your point, Marco, training, education is really important.
And I highly encourage the maritime industry, the maritime domain folks to get a third set of eyes, cold eye peer review on their own internal risk assessments, because of that internal bias and wanting to show optimization and trying to move people out of the way of risk sometimes drives their decisions to accept risk outside of their own criteria. And I see that quite often, especially when assessing vessels in ports. So I highly encourage folks to look at a third-party assessor that's certified and in the standards, but that also can bring that maritime aspect and complexity to be able to help you determine, did you accept a risk that wasn't tolerable, met your tolerable piece from a likelihood perspective. And the reason I say that is because the maritime domain right now is in a expansion mode when it comes to communications, backhaul. There was a time where we were just on VSAT, satellite communications, where we had 3 megabit uplink, which was pretty much max, and you had to pair those up to get even more output. Now we have low Earth orbit, and we actually have things like Starlink. So the amount of data we can get out of these vessels and the communications to these vessels are vast, much more than what we've had predominantly in the last 4 decades or 5 decades or more. I mean, this is kind of historic to have these vessels to be able to have that kind of throughput, meaning cyber adversaries could get to these ships quicker, faster, do payloads, have more time to establish communications and links. And the other part of it too, and I talk about this in my normalization of deviance talk, is that we're also doing things such as remote dynamic positioning, remote operations centers, which, don't get me wrong, I think these are great to have. But if we remove the human from the loop or remove that competency from these vessels, and we have, onshore driving of these vessels, that could be another Achilles heel into these systems. So I'm not against it. I'm just saying that we need to think clearly in our deviances from an engineering aspect and make sure we're tying that in to our risk assessments as we drive these new technologies and acceptance. Because once it's here, then we move on. In another decade, we'll be doing something else. And
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. In fact, I was at a conference this week. I won't say which one, but the point was brought up that a large number of people who work on cybersecurity on vessels haven't actually been on a vessel. How do you guys feel about that?
it's that's scary. I mean, that's the reality, but it's scary. And having been on vessels, I will tell you that you have to understand not only the culture, but you have to understand the systems and their backstops and how they're designed and deployed, and all the new stuff that's coming out that's actually on them. So there are several folks and companies that are out there that haven't set foot on, and we've said this a lot in the even in the training is, you want to take good practices from IT and move those over into certain aspects of operational technology, but it's not one for one. And we teach this in the 32 class, which is the introductory classes. Take some of the good things that do fit, that will work in OT, but keep in mind that operational technology is safety, reliability, availability, and integrity, and these systems must not fail, cannot fail. And so patching these things blindly like you do in your office environment is not acceptable. It has to be thought out. It has to be approved. It needs to go through management of change. And sometimes when you're dealing with people that have never been on a vessel or never worked with an electronics technician, working in these systems, they don't fully understand or grasp. And it's not that they're not smart or intelligent. That's not the case. It's that they just don't know the environment. And so we have to be careful with that, because if that does happen, to Steve's point, we might have vessels that are kind of spinning around in a channel one day. From a patch or update that should have never went live.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is really important to actually go to the facility, whatever it is, port or vessel, is that you get a completely different perspective on whether security controls are actually enforced and operational. So I've talked to a few people before about some of the things in my books where I'm pretty pessimistic about whether people are actually doing cybersecurity well in operational technology environments. And at least one person has said, well, that's pretty negative. I go to organizations all the time and they're doing a great job. And I go, well, it kind of depends where you go. Because if you go to the office and you see their security operations center and they've got big screens and flashing lights and alerts coming up saying, phishing attempt is stopped and all that, looks great. Then go to the operational facility, go to the vessel, and then see all the cabinets unlocked, all of the stickers with usernames and passwords on, all the USB ports unlocked, and the USB lock just sitting on the side there, and people allowing you into a room when you shouldn't be in the room, and just bad practices everywhere. So you would never see that unless you went to the actual facility, and so it's really critical that you see that, and for all the reasons you said as well.
One of my very first offshore vessel assessments, where it was someone had previously performed a check the box
Mm-hmm.
assessment from the actual shore side, from the beach. And so when we went on it, we found all types of communication links. We found third-party OEM laptops connected to the crew Wi-Fi, which had open internet access while being connected to the control system in the lower network. And I just remember the asset owner at that time. We were able to demonstrate this and show them, and they were just blown away, because all the checklists and all the previous folks that had assessed that vessel had said, no, I wouldn't say squeaky clean, but it was more of the lock your cabinets, do this, and likelihood was very low. And after going out and taking artifacts and taking images, and actually showing them while on vessel, I think that changed their perspective, which then changed many of their other partner vessel companies that they actually produced with or worked with to make modifications and changes. The maritime industry is at a very an important crossroads right now, especially with geopolitical tensions. We know that greater than 80% of our commerce goes through the maritime space. I talked about this last year at the ASC, the ISA conference in Orlando. And there's a history of clear early warning indicators. And I think we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing. If, from a vessel owner to the operator themselves, if you're touching operational technology in some way or shape or form, you need to be trained. You need to be,
Yeah.
get your training in and be part of the success.
As the leading professional society for automation, ISA hosts a number of conferences and events to bring this awesome community together. Coming up, we have the OT Cybersecurity Summit on June 16th through 18th in Prague. ISA wrote the world's leading standards and training for industrial cybersecurity, ISA IEC 62443. And this event is all about how to implement that critical guidance that keeps our infrastructure safe. We also have our flagship event, the ISA Automation Summit and Expo, on September 27 to 29 in Orlando. This event has something for everyone and is our fastest growing gathering, with over 630 attendees and 65 vendors last year. Whatever you're looking for, you can find it all at ASE. Visit isa.org/events to learn more.
And the whole concern about that issue is not what plant that was attacked, how it happened, but that the fact that everybody uses their cell phone for everything. And the untrained person who is unbeknowingly going around with their cell phone, where are they going? What are they doing? Where does that create a potential new threat? And what kind of new threat is kind of the interesting piece of it, right? When does AI get thrown into this mix? And when do we start talking about how that becomes an increasing vulnerability? When you start talking about a state actor utilizing something like a mobile device in order to work their way in any capacity, to me feels like something that needs to be zeroed in on, and how can we learn from that in order to secure ourselves a little bit better and just have a better overall cyber posture.
Absolutely.
So with that, the question is, what do you guys think the next threat is as far as AI is concerned? Digital twins. Steve, I know you work a lot with digital twins and moving some of the items from port to port. So do you have any insight about what you think is the next threat in that kind of space?
I think that biggest risk that I think is coming is that people willingly accept the new technology and don't think about the risks enough. So on their own, digital twin, AI, things like that, there's nothing wrong with them. And in fact, they can be useful to help things improve operationally. But their blind adoption without understanding what what's going on behind the scenes and also what the potential risks are that get created is really the biggest risk, big picture, So people really do need to, you can't just adopt AI. You have to say, well, how does AI work? What are the rules? How do we get those rules? What can they influence them? And that helps you understand, well, what could happen? What's the worst thing that could happen? And the worst thing that could happen is this, and therefore, what does that have impact on operations? And then have some mitigation in place to deal with that situation when it arises. And that's the other thing that people are not doing, right? So they're putting preventative controls in to say, let's make it more secure so you can not log in or unauthorized and things like that. But what about, let's pretend the incident happens. What do you do to minimize the consequences to the vessel or whatever it is? So that's the first thing. And then, I think otherwise, the other thing is that obviously these new technologies, especially if they're SaaS or platform as a service or infrastructure as a service based, they're just creating new access points to the vessel, right? So now, you've gone from vessel totally isolated or port totally isolated to connected to corporate networks, and then now connected to the cloud, and now connected to potentially someone else's cloud, who then is providing some software, which also provides to some other user. And now you've got infinitely more connection paths that you can get vulnerabilities through, right? So that is probably the biggest general issue, I would see.
Yeah, I agree with Steve, and especially when you get on some of these cruise liners where you have multiple tenants, multiple OEMs, sharing networks or riding networks, but also maintaining their own equipment, it can get very cumbersome. And we've seen this in the offshore space, Steve, especially with mobile offshore drilling and even production platforms like you and I know so well. But the reality is that sometimes these tenants may have their own network feed coming in through the service entrance through some type of satellite communication or networking technology, and so that risk needs to be fleshed out. I do see AI as a great benefit, but also as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We already know threat actors are using AI, nation states are using AI, we're using AI, and so we're also trying to use AI to counter AI. And so, do you want that let loose in your marine environment? Do you want that, in your production or your safety systems networks or safety critical networks for your ships? Probably not. You don't want AI fighting and defending on networks that are not meant to deal with that. These are meant to do propulsion, dynamic positioning, all the critical pieces that you would think, power management, power management systems, and what have you. And the last thing you need is some other threat that you're blind to, or these black box, unknown, very difficult to audit. So while I do appreciate AI, I think there's space for it in our OT industry, but I still want it not making decisions, still having a user in the loop to be able to say, hey, you could probably cut down on some of your NOx emissions if you throttled this back. Great. We'll take that input. We'll monitor, we'll manipulate that, and we'll manage it, but not do it on its own. I think we're not there yet, and that could have some ramifications. So I think that's kind of the future set, what we're dealing with. And then the one thing that I'm worried about is lack of or losing knowledge through retirement. So the aging workforce is real. There's many in the industry, including myself, that I still have some roadway left, but the reality is that we need to be able to start training, the newer, younger generations with why it's important to have specific manual capable controls, whether electric, pneumatic, hydraulic, in case these digital systems fail. We need people on these vessels. We need people at these ports that understand where these systems are in your actual environment, where they can go and actually have their standard of operating procedures to be able to run this if these systems are compromised or unavailable. And I think that's a very important piece that I still see even new systems today not incorporating. And I think I think that's one of our biggest threats. It's not so much the threat actors and all that. Yes, that is complicated, and yes, they're out in there within the networks. We've seen that in the U.S. where we still have threat actors within our telecoms networks that even the government has stated. But the reality is our aging workforce and not teaching the new folks how to do things and engineer out these risks, these digital risks, I think is going to be a problem. And we need to get ahead of that now, embed at the educational side, but make sure that we're instilling that knowledge from the exiting workforce into the younger generations of the how and the why. Those are key pieces.
I agree with that. I think a large issue too is the younger generation doesn't understand why anything outside of IT is important. And there's a clear missing gap. And we've seen that in some of the things that we're trying to do. ASE, you mentioned that earlier. We have this great cyber escape room that's turned into a student competition that we've been working on. And that's something that gets brought up, right, within conversations, and doing that is, and I know IT-OT convergence gets talked about until everybody's tired of hearing it. But I think there's still a gap in who understands that and who doesn't. So, obviously ISA's role is definitely push training. Automation depends on people. That's what we're here for, right? We're all on that page. Are there any other standards, though, that kind of cover some of these complexities, or is there room for something new?
Well, that's one of the nice things about ISA is that it comes from the instrumentation and control environment. Before it was called operational technology, and they've had many standards for many years that cover all kinds of critical aspects of those. So I'm going to think of ISA 84 for a start, functional safety. Everything we talked about really comes down to safety in a way, operational activities, but also safety. And so understanding how to do risk assessment, HAZOP, PHA, process hazard analysis, those kind of basic principles that are outlined in ISA 84, really critical to being able to do an effective cybersecurity risk assessment, because again, it's not really technology, it's all about the impact on the operations. But I would also shout out to ISA 18, which is about alarm management. So you can't do effective management of a vessel without some kind of system to track all the processes on the vessel. And, good alarm management is part of good situational awareness, which is also part of, cybersecurity as well. So if you see unusual activity, all of a sudden, that might be an indication of a compromise of some kind, and you might need to investigate it. And then things like HMI design, ISA 101. If you have good HMI designs on your vessel, again, you'll spot those kind of unusual activities before they become maybe too severe. There's other standards that apply to designs and drawings and documentation and things like that. But those ones for me are really important because they all fit together in any kind of OT environment, including a vessel or a port.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of those are also embedded into other programs and other industry guidance documents in standard globally. So
Right.
DNGL, ABSs, all refer to under the hood 62443, such as zones, conduits, risk assessments. So those are nice to see. And yes, on the alarm management, there's a new activity right now with IMO that's being led through Lloyd's that is circled around alarm management. There'll be some things that they're going to adopt from 18.2, from ISA's 18.2 alarm management, but it won't be one for one because response to these alarms may have a different output. So there's some alignment that needs to happen on the vessels. But the good news is they don't have to start from scratch. And so there's some, especially having alarm philosophy. These are really important. And when you ask some vessel owners or vessel operators, show me your alarm philosophy, and they point up to the bridge, then they point down to the engine control room, then they're pointing at each other. So I think starting at the engine control room is going to be the first start, and that's what the IMO is focused on this year.
Yeah, well, we're really excited because we're going to bring all of these topics full circle at our OT Cybersecurity Summit. It's in Prague, and I know that seems a little funky to have a maritime focus, but it's not just maritime, it's transportation in general. So we're going to be talking about 118, we're going to be talking about 84, we're going to be talking about ISA IEC 62443, all within transportation and how that's working with everyone, how that impacts the supply chain. So I do encourage anybody who's interested in hearing more about any of this conversation to absolutely sign up for that event and have the cyber focus. We also, Marco mentioned the IC32 class is the beginner class that's being offered in person there. If there's any interest, we offer IC32 year round in multiple locations. So I encourage anybody to check out the training schedule. But we also have our Automation Summit and Expo. It will be in Orlando again with a similar feel for what we did last year. But ISA's got a whole bunch of public offerings for large 10 events, and we're doing this podcast, we're doing blog posts around some of these things to try to highlight how current events are still impacted by some of these standards that have been around for a while, but we are moving with what is new and how we can get better involved to make sure that we're meeting the needs of everybody. So I want to continue that message and kind of wrap everything up with saying thank you for helping us bring to terms how we can really identify automation depends on people. You got to train your people. We got to get everybody up to date on what's going on. Cybersecurity impacts everybody. That is a Steve Mustard quote that I hear him say frequently. And that's not just to, take a jab at Steve. It's more so to start the conversation about how if you're not focused on if cybersecurity impacts you or not, you're part of the problem. And it's an education factor of making sure that everybody gets that. And if we can get cybersecurity professionals who are working on vessels in ports, that also helps with the education factor. So we're here to explore some of those options and how we can do different things. We do look to move some of our events into some areas where we could potentially do more conversations around this on site. So I'm looking forward to new possibilities, and I very much appreciate the two of you being on board with that entire conversation and how we can continue to push all of these things forward for ISA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And that's it for this episode of Podomation.
This has been Podomation, brought to you by the International Society of Automation. Thanks for listening, and remember to subscribe and review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people to find our content. Podomation is produced by me, Liz Neiman, and Morgan Foor at ISA. Our music is by Mixer Drummer and has been licensed from Pond 5.